The dust swirled around the wagon wheels as they rolled away from the homestead, leaving behind a trail of broken promises and shattered dreams. Rosie May stood barely 5 feet tall in the doorway of what had once been her home, watching her husband's silhouette disappear into the horizon. At 23, she had already been abandoned twice, first by her parents who couldn't afford another mouth to feed, and now by Thomas, the man who had promised to love her through sickness and health, but couldn't stomach the shame of having a wife who looked more like a child than a woman. The mortgage papers in her trembling hands felt heavier than her entire body. 3 months. That's all the time the bank had given her before they'd come to collect what was rightfully theirs. Thomas had signed the deed over to her out of guilt, but guilt wouldn't pay the bills or work the land. The neighbors had already made their feelings clear. A woman her size had no business trying to run a homestead alone. They whispered behind their hands about how she'd never find another man, how she was cursed with a body that would never bear children, how she should just accept defeat and move back east, where someone might take pity on her. But Rosie May had learned long ago that the only person she could count on was herself. She folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her apron pocket, then walked to the mirror that hung crooked on the wall. The reflection that stared back at her was delicate, almost ethereal, with auburn hair that caught the light like copper wire and green eyes that held more fire than her small frame suggested. She had the face of a porcelain doll and the spirit of a wildcat, though few people ever bothered to look past the surface. The first week alone was the hardest. The well rope was too heavy for her to pull up alone, so she had to devise a pulley system using an old wagon wheel. The chickens seemed to sense her vulnerability and scattered whenever she approached, forcing her to crawl under the coop to collect eggs. The cow, a stubborn Holstein named Bessie, refused to be milked by anyone other than Thomas and would kick over the bucket every time Rosie tried to approach. By the end of the week, her hands were blistered and bleeding, her back ached from the constant bending and lifting, and she had barely managed to collect enough eggs and milk to keep herself fed. By the second week, she had developed a routine. She woke before dawn, when the air was still cool and the world held its breath in anticipation of another scorching day. She would tend to the animals first, speaking to them in soft, gentle tones until they began to trust her touch. The vegetable garden required constant attention. The tomatoes needed staking, the beans needed picking, and the corn needed weeding. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and brown from the sun. She learned to use her size to her advantage, crawling between the rows of vegetables where a larger person would have trampled the plants. The loneliness crept in during the quiet hours. She would sit on the porch after supper, watching the stars emerge one by one against the vast Texas sky, and wonder if she was fooling herself. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe she was too small, too fragile, too different to survive in a world built for bigger, stronger people. The coyotes would howl in the distance, and she would clutch her father's old rifle closer to her chest, knowing that if danger came calling, she would have to be ready to face it alone. It was during the 3rd week that she first saw him. She was struggling to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by the wind when a shadow fell across her work. Looking up, she found herself staring at the largest man she had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun and arms that looked like they could wrestle a bull to the ground. His skin was weathered and scarred, telling stories of countless battles and hard-won victories. Long black hair hung past his shoulders, and his eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense. Most frightening of all was his reputation. This was Black Wolf, the half-breed warrior who had terrorized the frontier for years. Stories followed him like shadows, tales of entire settlements fleeing at the mere mention of his name, of soldiers who had tried to capture him and were never seen again, of a man who moved through the wilderness like a ghost and struck like lightning. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw only added to his fearsome appearance, and the way he carried himself suggested a predator who had never known defeat. Rosie May's first instinct was to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She stood frozen, hammer in hand, as he approached the fence line. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his moccasins making no sound on the hard, packed earth. When he reached the fence, he stopped and studied her work with those unsettling gray eyes. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "The posts need to be deeper, or the wind will knock them down again." She found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm managing just fine, thank you." He tilted his head, studying her with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. "Where's your husband?" "Gone." The word came out sharper than she intended, carrying all the hurt and anger she had been trying to suppress. "He left you to work the land alone." "He left me because I'm too small to be of any use to anyone." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted showing vulnerability to this dangerous stranger. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or understanding. "Size isn't everything," he said simply. "Sometimes the smallest creatures are the most dangerous." With that cryptic comment, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the scrub brush as silently as he had appeared. Rosie May stood there for a long time, her heart pounding, wondering if she had imagined the entire encounter. But the imprint of his boots in the dirt proved that Black Wolf had been there, and for reasons she couldn't understand, he had chosen not to harm her. The next morning, she found a deer carcass hanging from the old oak tree near her garden. It had been expertly cleaned and butchered, with enough meat to last her weeks. There was no note, no sign of who had left it, but she knew. She spent the day smoking the meat and preserving what she could, grateful for the unexpected bounty, but wary of what it might mean. That night, she lay awake listening to every sound, wondering if he was watching her from the darkness. He appeared again 3 days later, this time while she was trying to clear a fallen tree from her path to the creek. She had been working for hours, her small hands blistered and bleeding as she tried to move branches that weighed more than she did. He watched her struggle for several minutes before finally stepping forward. "Move aside," he said not unkindly. She bristled at the command. "I can handle it myself." "You're going to hurt yourself. I've been hurt before. It didn't kill me." He studied her for a long moment, and she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. "You're stubborn." "I'm determined." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "There's a difference." Before she could answer, he had grasped the fallen trunk and lifted it as easily as if it were a fallen branch. His muscles strained against his buckskin shirt, and she found herself staring at the display of raw power. He moved the tree aside and cleared the path, then turned back to her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "I know what it's like to be alone." This time, when he left, she called out after him. "What's your real name?" He paused without turning around. "Daniel. Daniel Crowfeather." That night, she lay awake thinking about the man behind the legend. Daniel. It was such an ordinary name for someone who had inspired so much fear. She wondered what had driven him to become the notorious Black Wolf, what pain had shaped him into the solitary warrior who haunted the frontier. Despite everything she had heard about him, he had shown her nothing but kindness. As the days passed, their encounters became more frequent. He would appear when she was struggling with some task that required more strength than she possessed, offering help with few words but gentle actions. He never stayed long, and he never asked for anything in return. Slowly, she began to look forward to his visits, though she was careful not to let her guard down completely. It was during one of these encounters that she learned the truth about his past. She was sitting by the creek, trying to mend a tear in her dress, when he emerged from the trees like a shadow-given form. Instead of helping with some task, he sat down beside her on the bank, his presence both comforting and unsettling. "You're not afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be?" He was quiet for a moment, staring out at the water. "Most people are. Most people judge by appearances." She set down her sewing and looked at him directly. "I've learned not to trust first impressions." "What do you see when you look at me?" The question was so unexpected that she had to think about her answer. "I see someone who's been hurt. Someone who's tired of being alone." His jaw tightened. "I'm not a good man, Rosie May. I've done things, terrible things. So has everyone. In their own way." She picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water. "My husband abandoned me when I needed him most. My parents sold me to the first man who would take me. People have called me a freak, a curse, a burden. Does that make me a terrible person? That's different. Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "Tell me about the terrible things you've done." He told her then, in halting words, about his childhood on the reservation, about watching his mother die of smallpox while the government doctors stood by and did nothing. He spoke of his father, a cavalry officer who had refused to acknowledge his half-breed son, and of the years he had spent fighting a war that could never be won. He described the rage that had consumed him, the need for vengeance that had driven him to become the very monster that people feared. "I killed men," he said finally. "Good men. Some of them. Men who were just doing their jobs. Were they trying to kill you?" "Yes, but then you were defending yourself." She reached out and touched his scarred hand. "Survival isn't a sin, Daniel." He stared down at their joined hands, his calloused fingers dwarfing hers. "You're too small to be touching a killer. And you're too gentle to be one." Something broke in his expression, a wall crumbling that had built over years of pain and isolation. "I could hurt you without meaning to." "You could," she agreed, "but you won't." That night, he didn't leave. Instead, he sat on her porch, his rifle across his knees, standing guard against the darkness. She watched him through her window. This fierce warrior who had appointed himself her protector, and felt something stir in her chest that she had never experienced before. It wasn't fear or gratitude or even attraction, though all of those were present. It was recognition, the sudden, startling realization that she was looking at the other half of her soul. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but undeniable. He began staying longer during his visits, helping with repairs around the homestead and sharing meals with her in comfortable silence. She learned that he was incredibly intelligent, able to read and write in 3 languages, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. He discovered that she was far stronger than her appearance suggested, both physically and emotionally, and that her laughter was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He began teaching her things that would help her survive: how to track animals, how to read the weather, how to move silently through the brush. She taught him about farming, about coaxing life from the stubborn soil, about the patience required to nurture growing things. They complemented each other perfectly, her gentle persistence balancing his fierce strength. The neighbors began to notice his presence, and the whispers grew louder. Some spoke of calling in the cavalry, of ridding the territory of the savage who had taken up residence with the strange little woman. Others simply avoided her property altogether, crossing themselves when they passed by as if she had been cursed. But Rosie May had stopped caring about what other people thought. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen and valued for who she was. It was during the hottest part of summer that disaster struck. A drought had been building for weeks, and the creek that supplied water to her homestead had dwindled to a trickle. The vegetables in her garden were withering despite her efforts to conserve water, and the animals were becoming listless and weak. Worse still, the mortgage payment was due in less than a month, and she had no money saved. She was sitting on her porch one evening, trying to figure out how to make $5 stretch to cover 50, when Daniel appeared beside her. He had a way of moving so silently that she never heard him coming, but she had grown accustomed to his presence. "You're worried," he observed, settling down beside her on the wooden steps. "The bank wants their money," she said simply. "I don't have it. How much do you need?" She told him, and he nodded thoughtfully. "How?" His expression darkened. "There are ways." "No." She grabbed his arm, her small fingers wrapping around his wrist. "I won't let you become an outlaw again because of me. What choice do we have? We'll find another way." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Daniel spoke again. "There's a bounty on my head. $500. Daniel, no, hear me out." He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "I turn myself in, collect the reward, and use it to pay off your mortgage. They'll hang you. Maybe. Maybe not. I've heard rumors that they're looking for information about other renegades more than they want my blood. I might be able to negotiate. It's too dangerous. Everything worth doing is dangerous." He reached out and touched her face gently, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek. "You're the first person who's ever made me want to be better than I am. Let me do this for you." She leaned into his touch, tears streaming down her face. "I can't lose you." "You won't." His voice was firm, certain. "I promise you that." The next morning he was gone. She searched the property, calling his name, but found only a note tucked under her door. In his careful handwriting, he had written, "Trust me, I will come back to you. Build something beautiful while I'm gone." The days that followed were the longest of her life. She threw herself into her work, trying to keep her mind occupied, but worry ate at her like a cancer. Every rider on the horizon made her heart race, hoping it was Daniel returning, fearing it was news of his death. The neighbors began to whisper again, speculating about what had happened to her mysterious protector. Despite her fear, she took his words to heart. She spent her days working on improvements to the homestead, channeling her anxiety into productive labor. She expanded the chicken coop, repaired the barn roof, and planted a small flower garden beside the house. Every nail she hammered, every board she sawed, was a prayer for his safe return. It was exactly 2 weeks later that she saw the dust cloud on the horizon. A lone rider was approaching, and even from a distance, she could tell it was him. She ran from the house, her heart pounding, and met him at the gate. He looked thinner, more tired, but he was alive and whole. "You came back," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "I promised I would." He reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked with the sound of coins. $500, enough to pay off the mortgage and have some left over. She stared at the money, then at him. "How?" "I had information they wanted. Names, locations, plans. I traded what I knew for my freedom and the bounty." "You betrayed your own people." His expression was grim. "I betrayed men who were already dead, Rosie May. Men who had chosen a path that could only end in destruction. I gave the army information about abandoned camps and old hideouts. In return, they agreed to consider my debt to society paid. That night, they rode into town together to settle her debt with the bank." The banker, a thin man with nervous eyes, counted out the money twice before accepting it. As they walked out of the building, Daniel suddenly stopped and turned to her. "Marry me?" he said. She stared at him in shock. "What?" "I know I'm not much of a catch. I'm a half-breed with a violent past and no prospects. But I love you, Rosie May. I love your strength, your kindness, your refusal to give up even when the whole world is against you. I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you and making you happy." She felt tears spring to her eyes. "Daniel, I know people will talk. They'll say you're too small for me, that we don't belong together. But I don't care what they think. You're perfect just as you are." She looked up at this fierce gentleman who had seen past her size to the person she truly was. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed by the circuit preacher the following Sunday, with only the banker and his wife as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, held in the small church at the edge of town, but to Rosie May, it was more beautiful than any grand wedding could have been. When Daniel slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, she felt complete for the first time in her life. The years that followed were not easy, but they were filled with love and purpose. Daniel proved to be a skilled carpenter, and he began taking jobs building houses and barns for the few neighbors who were willing to overlook his past. Together, they expanded the homestead, building a larger house with rooms sized for both of them. High ceilings for him, cozy nooks for her. Daniel's reputation slowly changed from feared outlaw to respected craftsman. His work was solid and dependable, and word spread that he was a man of his word. Rosie May became known as the woman who could nurse a sick animal back to health or help deliver a difficult birth. She had a way with living things that seemed almost magical, coaxing life from the most hopeless situations. The townspeople slowly began to accept them, drawn by Daniel's quiet competence and Rosie May's gentle kindness. Children who had once crossed the street to avoid them began stopping by the homestead to pet the animals or sample Rosie May's famous honey cakes. Their love story became legend, whispered around campfires and told in parlors, the tale of the smallest woman in the territory who had tamed the fiercest warrior. They never had children of their own, but their home became a sanctuary for others who needed refuge. Runaway slaves found safe passage with them, as did women fleeing abusive husbands and children who had been orphaned by disease or violence. Their small cabin became a haven for the lost and broken, a place where size and color and past mistakes didn't matter. Daniel built additional rooms onto the house, creating spaces for their guests and ensuring that no one who sought their help would be turned away. He taught the young men who came to them the skills of carpentry and farming, while Rosie May taught the women and children about cooking, sewing, and the healing arts. Together, they created a community of the discarded and forgotten, showing them that everyone had value regardless of what the world might say. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Daniel surprised her with a gift. He had been working on it in secret for months, and when he led her outside to see it, she gasped in wonder. He had built her a gazebo in the garden, perfectly sized for someone of her stature, with intricate carvings and a roof painted to look like the sky. It was beautiful and thoughtful and completely unnecessary, which made it all the more precious. "Why?" she asked, running her hands over the smooth wood. "Because you deserve beautiful things," he said simply. "Because you've made my life beautiful, and I wanted to give some of that back to you." She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, this giant of a man who had seen the strength in her small frame and the beauty in her different perspective. Around them, the garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that she had coaxed from the stubborn Texas soil, proof that the smallest seeds could grow into the most magnificent plants. As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. Daniel's hair began to show streaks of silver, and lines appeared around Rosie May's eyes from years of squinting in the sun. But their devotion to each other never wavered. They had learned that true love wasn't about finding someone who fit society's expectations, but about finding someone who saw your soul and loved what they found there. The homestead prospered under their care. What had once been a struggling farm became a thriving enterprise, with healthy livestock, abundant crops, and a reputation for quality that stretched across the territory. Visitors came from miles around to see the remarkable couple who had built something beautiful from nothing, who had taken two broken lives and woven them into something stronger than either could have achieved alone. Daniel continued to build, his hands creating beauty wherever they touched. He made furniture that was both functional and artistic, buildings that would stand for generations, and improvements to the homestead that showed his deep love for the woman who had given him a reason to create rather than destroy. His carpentry became his art, his way of showing the world that he was more than the violent man he had once been. Rosie May's garden became famous throughout the region. She had a gift for understanding what plants needed, for creating the perfect conditions for growth and abundance. People would travel for days to buy her vegetables and learn her secrets. Though she would always tell them that the real secret was simply caring enough to pay attention to what was needed. As the sun set over their homestead one evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Rosie May reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been abandoned by those who should have loved her, dismissed by those who should have seen her worth, and written off by a world that valued size over substance. But she had refused to give up, refused to accept that her small stature meant she was destined for a small life, and in return, she had been given the greatest gift of all, a love that saw her not as too small, but as perfectly sized for the life she was meant to live. Daniel had built her more than a cabin. He had built her a home, a family, a future filled with purpose and joy. Together, they had proven that true strength comes not from size, but from the courage to keep fighting when everyone else has given up. The neighbors still whispered sometimes, marveling at the unlikely pair who had found happiness against all odds. But their whispers had changed from mockery to admiration, from fear to respect. They spoke of the small woman who could tame the wildest horse, and the fierce warrior who had learned to love more than he had ever learned to fight. And in the quiet moments, when the work was done and the house was still, Rosie May would sit in her gazebo and watch the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky. She would think about all the people who had told her she was too small, too different, too much trouble to be worth loving. And she would smile, knowing that they had been wrong about everything that mattered. She was exactly the right size for the life she had built, exactly the right person for the man who had chosen to spend his days protecting her dreams and sharing her hopes. In a world that measured worth by inches and pounds, she had found someone who measured it by the size of her heart and the strength of her spirit. The little woman and the savage warrior had built more than a life together. They had built a legacy of love that would outlast any storm, any hardship, any voice that dared to suggest that different meant less than. And in the end, that was all that mattered, not how small she was, but how large she had dared to dream, and how perfectly she had been loved in return.